Mark Wahlberg secretly walks into his own restaurant, but stops when he hears a server crying. Mark Wahlberg stepped out of a discreet black SUV and onto the uneven asphalt behind a modest Wahlburgers location nestled in a quieter part of Boston, one that hadn't been overrun by tourists or media. He wore a loose-fitting hoodie, navy blue joggers, a faded Boston Red Sox cap pulled low, and aviator sunglasses that masked most of his recognizable face. Today wasn't about publicity or fanfare. It wasn't about checking in with executives or holding a staff meeting surrounded by camera flashes. Today was about silence, about invisibility, about rediscovering what he had built from the inside out. He had chosen this location specifically because he hadn't visited it in almost 3 years. When it first opened, it was thriving, staffed with bright-eyed team members and full of energy. But lately, murmurs had reached his ears. Whispers about management issues, high staff turnover, dropping morale. Though regional managers sent glowing reports, Mark trusted his gut more than spreadsheets. So here he was, stripped of celebrity, just a quiet observer hoping to find the truth beneath the surface. The back lot smelled of trash bins and fryer oil, the kind of gritty scent only a Royale restaurant produced. He inhaled it with a strange kind of nostalgia, a reminder of where it all began. He made his way toward the employee entrance, nodding at a delivery guy wheeling in crates of produce. The man didn't look twice at him. Perfect. Mark had asked one of his most trusted aides to give him access to the internal systems. Door codes, security clearances, even a nondescript staff badge clipped to his pocket with the name Mike W. On it, just another shift worker blending into the background. As he slipped into the hallway that led to the kitchen, he could hear the hum of dinner prep building, orders being called out, pans clanging, and the sizzle of burger patties hitting hot grills. It felt alive, but there was also a tension in the air he couldn't quite name. The lighting in the back corridors was dim, flickering slightly overhead. He noticed stained tiles underfoot, scuffed walls, and a bulletin board cluttered with outdated schedules and faded Employee of the Month portraits. The last one dated almost 9 months ago. A little red flag fluttered in his mind. In all his locations, culture was supposed to matter. Recognition, community, pride. Here, the pride seemed to be fading, one dusty corner at a time. Mark walked slowly, glancing through the narrow kitchen window as he passed. The staff looked rushed. A young man dropped a metal spatula, cursed under his breath, and no one offered help or comfort. A tall woman with a headset barked out orders with the kind of tone that came more from pressure than leadership. Everyone looked tired. No smiles, no camaraderie. He lingered outside the kitchen, still undecided on whether to walk through and test the dining experience firsthand. That had been his plan, to order a burger, sit quietly in a corner booth, and just observe how guests were treated, how the food tasted, how the energy felt. But as he turned to head toward the dining room entrance, a soft, unexpected sound halted him in his tracks. It wasn't part of the usual restaurant soundtrack. It was something far more fragile. Aqui é, breate sobe. Muffled but unmistakable. At first, he thought he'd imagined it. Maybe it was someone sneezing or laughing. But then he heard it again. A sniffle. Then the hiccuping exhale that followed a stifled cry. It was coming from just down the side hallway near the staff lockers and break room. Mark hesitated. This wasn't what he'd planned to get involved in. He was here to watch, not to interfere. But the sound reached deep into his chest, stirring something he hadn't felt in a long time. Memories of his own family flashed across his mind. His brothers, his mother, his childhood full of noise and hardship, where moments of quiet crying meant something real was wrong. Instinct took over. He turned down the hallway, walking quietly past a cleaning closet and a rack of mop buckets. The crying became clearer. Someone was trying not to be heard, but the kind of pain they were carrying couldn't be muffled easily. As he reached the break room door, left ajar just a few inches, he slowed, cautious not to startle whoever was inside. Peering in, he saw a small figure hunched over a table, her shoulders shaking, face buried in her hands. A half-eaten sandwich sat untouched beside her, and a plastic drink cup with the name Jenna, scrawled on it in fading marker, sat near her elbow. Mark gently knocked on the edge of the door with 2 knuckles. The sound soft but intentional. The girl jumped slightly, wiping her face quickly, trying to mask the evidence of her tears. I'm fine, she said automatically, without looking up. Her voice was cracked and thin, the kind of voice people use when they're hoping you'll just walk away. But Mark didn't. He leaned against the doorframe, arms crossed loosely, using his calmest voice. Didn't mean to interrupt. Just heard someone was having a rough moment. She glanced up briefly, eyes red and swollen. She didn't recognize him, not yet. To her, he was just another guy from the kitchen or maybe someone new starting a shift. Her lips trembled as she tried to force a smile. I'm okay. Just needed to breathe. Mark gave a small nod, then walked into the room slowly, keeping his distance. Mind if I sit? He asked, motioning to the bench across from her. She didn't say anything but didn't object, so he lowered himself down and sat, elbows on the table, his gaze focused more on his hands than her, giving her the space to speak or not. Silence hung between them, but it wasn't awkward. It was spacious, like both of them were catching their breath inside it. Name's Mike, he said eventually, using the alias printed on his badge. First day at this location. Just shadowing, really? She nodded again, sniffling. I'm Jenna, she said softly. Been here almost 7 months. Her voice cracked again on the last word, and she quickly looked down. Mark didn't pry. Instead, he reached for the napkin dispenser, pulled a couple out, and slid them across the table toward her. This place always this rough? He asked, casually but gently. She hesitated, clearly weighing whether to tell the truth. After a pause, she let out a small, bitter laugh. It depends on who's managing that day, and how much sleep you got, and whether a customer screamed at you yet. She wiped her eyes, avoiding his gaze. Or whether you're late on rent and just found out your brother's in the hospital again. The words tumbled out faster than she meant, and she immediately closed her mouth, ashamed of the vulnerability. But Mark didn't react with pity. He just nodded slowly, absorbing it. You know, he said, voice low. I've been in a few places in my life where I felt like the walls were closing in, like nothing I did was enough. She looked up at him for the first time with true curiosity. Something about his tone wasn't rehearsed. It wasn't polite customer service compassion. It was real. And even though she didn't know who he was, she sensed that the man in front of her had known hard times. Yeah? She asked. What did you do? Mark smiled faintly. I found one thing I could fix. Just one. Something small. Something in my control. And then I did it again the next day. One brick at a time. Jenna's lip trembled again, but she nodded. Hard to do when you're working doubles 6 days a week and nobody even notices. She looked down again. Sometimes it just feels like no one gives a damn. Mark felt those words hit deeper than he expected. He had built this restaurant chain on the values of hard work and family. If one of his employees felt this forgotten, how many others did? He realized this wasn't just a moment. It was a message. And what he did next would define not just her experience, but the soul of the place he had created. But for now, he kept his identity hidden, choosing instead to listen more than speak, knowing the truth was only beginning to unravel. Jenna's silence lingered in the air like dust suspended in sunlight, fragile and waiting to fall. Mark remained seated across from her, hands folded on the table, never pushing, just present. That moment, that small pocket of stillness in the back of a bustling restaurant, was louder than the chaos echoing through the walls. The clatter of dishes and barked orders from the kitchen still bled faintly into the break room. But in here, it was as if the two of them existed in a different dimension. Jenna took a shaky breath and looked down at her half-eaten sandwich like she was trying to remember when she last felt hungry. She picked at the crust without lifting her head, her fingers trembling just slightly, betraying a deeper exhaustion that no nap or day off could fix. Mark watched her with quiet focus, every instinct telling him that there was more behind her tears than just a bad day. There was a heaviness in her eyes, the kind that settles into your bones after too many disappointments. The kind of weight you carry alone when you've convinced yourself no one would care enough to help carry it with you. He didn't speak again, didn't rush her, but instead allowed the silence to become a gentle nudge, encouraging rather than pressing. Eventually, her fingers stilled, and she looked up with an expression that wavered between vulnerability and guardedness. You ever work a job where it feels like you're drowning but no one notices because everyone else is too busy trying not to drown too? She asked, her voice hoarse from crying. Mark nodded slowly, thinking back to his early days on construction sites, to cleaning gym floors before the sun came up, to sleeping in cramped apartments with 4 brothers and no air conditioning. Yeah, he said simply. I have. That answer seemed to crack something open in her because suddenly she was speaking, not all at once, but like a faucet that had long been rusted shut and was finally turning loose. She told him about her brother who'd been in and out of the hospital with complications from diabetes, and how she was covering most of the bills because her parents were broke and out of state. She told him how she picked up extra shifts, covering for coworkers who quit or called out, and how every week felt like a new test she wasn't sure she could pass. Her manager, she said, had stopped saying thank you months ago and started treating every mistake like a personal insult. She described customers who berated her over fries being too cold, a woman who once threw a milkshake at her over a forgotten straw, and a man who left a nasty note instead of a tip, telling her to smile more. Mark felt his jaw tighten at that. He hated when people used service workers as emotional punching bags, forgetting they were human beings with struggles, dreams, and stories of their own. Jenna's story wasn't unique, but that didn't make it any less painful. What made it worse, she explained, was the way the workplace itself had changed. When she first started, people laughed during shifts, helped each other out, brought cupcakes for birthdays. But lately, no one looked each other in the eye anymore. The new assistant manager, Josh, she said, only seemed interested in playing favorites and flexing his authority. He scheduled people unpredictably, cut hours last minute, and gave raises only to the staff he partied with outside of work. Several good workers had quit because of him, and those left behind just kept their heads down, afraid to lose their jobs. She said she tried to report him once to the corporate number posted in the break room, but no one ever called her back. Her voice cracked again as she described how powerless she felt, how she'd come in today hoping it would be better, only to find that Josh had cut her Friday shift for no reason and then blamed her for attitude when she asked why. She said she came to the break room to cry before she said something she'd regret and get fired for it. Mark listened, absorbing every word, his face a mask of calm while his heart churned with frustration. He had built Wahlburgers to be more than just a burger joint. It was supposed to be a place where people felt like family. Hearing that someone like Jenna felt invisible, unheard, and mistreated under his name ignited something deep in him. Still, he didn't reveal who he was. Not yet. He didn't want her to stop talking. He wanted the truth unfiltered. He wanted to know what his people weren't telling him, what was lost in the neat reports and curated meetings. Jenna apologized after a while, cheeks still blotchy but voice steadier. I didn't mean to dump all that on you. You probably think I'm crazy. Mark shook his head. No. I think you're doing your best in a system that's not doing right by you. That stunned her for a second, as if she hadn't expected anyone to say it out loud. Then she smiled for the first time, small and tired, but real. Thanks, she said. Most people just tell me to suck it up. Mark stood, stretching his legs, and looked toward the hallway. You heading back out there? He asked. Jenna wiped her face with a napkin and nodded. Yeah, it's just a dinner rush. It'll pass. But there was a hollowness in her tone that betrayed how much she dreaded it. As they left the break room, the din of the restaurant grew louder, the bright fluorescent lights of the kitchen washing over them like stage lights snapping on. Jenna walked ahead, shoulders squared in a way that said she was putting her armor back on. Mark lingered just a moment, then turned and took a detour. He wasn't going to the dining area just yet. Something inside told him that before he could face the customers, he needed to see more of the people behind the curtain. The real heartbeat of any restaurant wasn't the menu. It was the staff. The people flipping the burgers, ringing the registers, scrubbing the dishes. And if there was rot in the foundation, No amount of smiling advertisements could cover that stench. As he passed a dish pit tucked behind the kitchen, he noticed an older man, probably in his 60s, hosing down trays with robotic precision, his face expressionless. He looked exhausted, like he'd been working since sunrise. No one spoke to him. No one even looked at him. In the prep area, two teenage boys were slicing onions in silence, earbuds in, heads down. The room was filled with bodies, but absent of connection. He saw a cook take a verbal lashing from Josh. Mark recognized him from Jenna's description, and watched how the man's face flushed red before he turned away, swallowing whatever comeback he might have wanted to give. Mark made a mental note of everything. Every missed opportunity for kindness, every crack in the foundation, every moment where the place he had dreamed of becoming a beacon for community now felt like a machine slowly chewing through people. He continued his quiet walkthrough, observing, noting the tension in the air. His heart was heavier than when he entered. It wasn't just one crying server. It was an entire ecosystem teetering on burnout. It wasn't about one shift, one manager, or one off night. It was systemic, and it was his name on the wall, his name on the shirts, his name in the mouths of customers. That meant responsibility, real responsibility, not just to profits or shareholders, but to every Jenna trying to hold herself together in a break room while no one listened. As he walked toward the dining area at last, Mark realized something had shifted in him. He came in today to check on his business. But now it wasn't about business anymore. It was about the people. It was about reclaiming the values that made him start this in the first place. The smell of burgers and fries filled his nose as he stepped toward the swing doors, but his appetite was gone. What he wanted now was clarity, and justice, and change. He paused just before pushing the door open, inhaled deeply, and prepared himself. The next part would require more than observation. It would require action. But first, he needed one more thing. He needed to talk to Josh. Mark pushed through the double doors into the heart of the kitchen, the heavy rubber flaps swinging behind him with a soft thud, muffling the clatter of the dining area beyond. The heat hit him instantly, grease-slicked air, the smell of charred meat, and the sharp sting of cleaning chemicals mixed into one sensory punch that brought him right back to his teenage years working in back kitchens to make ends meet. There was something sacred about a kitchen at rush hour. The pressure, the rhythm, the dance of organized chaos. But here, beneath the rhythmic cadence of spatulas scraping griddles and fryers bubbling with golden oil, there was a subtle discord, a broken harmony that undercut every movement. The staff moved efficiently, but not with passion or unity. There were no jokes shouted over the sizzle, no banter, no signs of a team bound together by camaraderie. Instead, there were slouched shoulders, darting glances, flinches whenever the headset crackled to life with the voice of a manager barking orders like a drill sergeant without patience. Mark watched from a safe corner, standing beside a stack of dry goods, as if he were another new hire waiting for direction, his face obscured by his cap and the shadow of the dim ceiling light above. He scanned the room until he found him, Josh, the assistant manager Jenna had mentioned. A tall, lean man in his early 30s. Josh wore his uniform shirt half unbuttoned and had a smugness that bled through every gesture. He wasn't helping on the line, nor running food, nor cleaning. He was standing near the kitchen monitors with his arms folded and a Bluetooth earpiece jammed in his right ear, flicking through a tablet that seemed more like a prop than a tool. Every so often, he'd mutter something to a line cook, not with instruction but with condescension, and then scroll through the screen again like he was too important for real work. Mark's blood simmered as he watched Josh raise his voice at a young hostess who had accidentally double-seated a table, reducing her to a stammering apology in front of half the staff. It wasn't a critical error, just a minor hiccup in a chaotic dinner rush, but Josh treated it like a felony. Mark saw the way the girl's face flushed red as she nodded and turned away quickly, blinking back what looked like the start of tears. It was leadership by fear, the worst kind, the kind that didn't demand respect, only submission. Mark had seen enough. He knew he couldn't just walk up and reveal who he was yet. The situation needed a scalpel, not a sledgehammer. So instead, he quietly exited the kitchen and looped back through the employee hallway, slipping into the small manager's office nestled behind the dry storage. The room was cluttered, papers strewn across the desk, expired safety training certificates taped carelessly to the wall, and a mini fridge humming loudly in the corner. Mark sat at the desk, pulled out his phone, and made a quick call to the regional manager under whom this location fell. A man named Darren who had once promised to keep the Wahlburgers standard alive in every store he oversaw. When Darren answered, chipper and oblivious, Mark wasted no time. He kept his voice low but firm, telling Darren to stay on standby for an urgent internal review, and that he was currently inside one of his stores under a pseudonym. Darren stammered, clearly thrown off, but Mark cut him off with a clipped assurance that everything would be explained later. Hanging up, he placed his phone face down on the desk and exhaled through his nose, the weight of what he'd seen beginning to settle like concrete in his chest. This wasn't just an issue of one bad apple. It was a cultural infection, subtle, slow, but dangerous. He returned to the kitchen and slipped back into the shadows, this time letting himself be seen a little more, enough that someone mistook him for a shift supervisor and handed him a tray of fresh fries to run to table 16. He took it without protest, winding through the kitchen to the dining room, and as he did, he took the opportunity to observe not just the employees but the guests. The restaurant was nearly full, families with small kids, couples on casual dates, a few solo diners buried in their phones. The place had good bones, he thought. It was still drawing a crowd, still fulfilling its function. But the soul was missing. The little details, the laughter, the warm hellos, the extra seconds spent at a table asking about someone's day, were absent. It was running like a machine, but Mark had never wanted a machine. He'd wanted a movement, a place where people could gather and feel better leaving than they did coming in. And yet here he was, surrounded by burnt-out staff and disengaged customers, in a room with his name etched in bold letters on the menu. After dropping off the fries, he took a moment to scan the floor and caught sight of Jenna weaving between tables with robotic precision, a practiced smile on her face that didn't reach her eyes. It hit him harder than he expected. No one should have to wear their pain like that and still serve with grace. She moved quickly, quietly, disappearing into the back again, and he followed, careful to keep a gap so she wouldn't notice. As he passed through the swing doors again, he saw Josh once more, now berating a cook for plating a burger too sloppily. The cook, a burly guy with tattoos and tired eyes, muttered an apology and began remaking the dish without protest. Mark had seen enough. He walked up to Josh, stopping just short of invading his personal space, and with a calm voice, said, "You treat all your team members like that? Or just the ones who don't kiss your ass?" Josh blinked, startled, then laughed nervously. "Who the hell are you?" he asked, eyeing the name tag. "You new or something?" Mark smiled faintly, took off his cap, and removed his sunglasses. In an instant, the color drained from Josh's face. Recognition dawned slowly, like a bad hangover. "Am Mark Wahlberg?" he stammered, eyes darting around. What are you?" Mark held up a hand, silencing him. "I've been here all night. I've seen how you talk to people. I've seen how you lead, if you can call it that." The entire kitchen went quiet, heads turning, spatulas frozen mid-air, the tension palpable. "This isn't how I built this place. This isn't what Wahlburgers is supposed to stand for," Mark continued, his voice still low but commanding. "You don't get to wear that manager badge if you don't care about the people under you." Josh opened his mouth to defend himself, but Mark stepped forward. "I've already spoken to corporate. You're being suspended while we investigate everything I saw tonight. If it were up to me, you'd be gone already." There was a stunned silence, followed by the unmistakable sound of someone in the back saying, "Damn," under their breath. Josh stood frozen, caught between disbelief and fear. "I suggest you clock out and go home," Mark added. "Someone will be in touch tomorrow." With that, Mark turned away, leaving Josh pale and trembling in his wake. The kitchen staff stared at him in stunned silence until Mark looked around and said, "You all deserve better than this, and I'm going to make sure you get it." That was when Jenna walked back in, her face registering total shock at the sight of him. Unmasked, revealed, real. Her tray nearly slipped from her hands. "You're—" she started, voice trembling. Mark nodded. "Yeah, I'm the guy who's supposed to make sure this place feels like a second home, not a battleground." He looked around at the stunned faces, every one of them now seeing him for who he really was. "Starting tomorrow," he said, "I'm working the line with you. No cameras, no interviews. Just me, one of the crew, and we're going to fix this place together." The words settled over the room like a promise, heavy but full of hope. And for the first time that night, something shifted in the air. Not silence, not fear, but belief. The first crack of light breaking through a very long night. Change had come, and it wasn't leaving. Not this time. Not on his watch. True to his word, Mark showed up the next morning at the Wahlburgers location before sunrise, dressed in the same low-key clothes as the day before, but this time with no sunglasses, no hat, and no aliases. The surprise from the staff when they saw him again, this time bright and early, not hidden in shadows, was palpable. But he waved off every attempt at fanfare with a simple, "I'm just here to work." He didn't want speeches or red carpets. He wanted a pair of gloves, a place on the schedule, and the freedom to witness firsthand what had gone wrong within the foundation of his business. The employees were still processing the previous night's bombshell, murmuring amongst themselves, unsure if this was a publicity stunt or something more genuine. But when Mark tied on an apron and started scrubbing down prep surfaces without hesitation, it slowly began to dawn on them that this wasn't for show. He asked the dishwasher, Luis, a quiet man who'd been with the company since the store's opening, where the degreaser was and whether the usual morning routine involved cleaning the fryer filters or just the tops. Luis blinked in confusion before answering, and when Mark nodded in thanks and got to work without any celebrity bravado, the vibe in the kitchen began to shift. He rotated through stations all morning, shadowing line cooks, checking in with hosts, watching the way orders came in and how the staff scrambled to keep up. He didn't just stand over their shoulders, he got in the trenches with them, flipping patties, wrapping burgers, filling sauces. He worked side by side with a teenage grill cook named Dante, who admitted in a hushed tone that he'd been thinking of quitting before college because the stress wasn't worth the paycheck. Mark didn't lecture him. He just nodded and kept working, asking real questions like how long it took him to learn the grill timing and whether anyone had taught him proper heat rotation. Dante blinked, caught off guard by the interest, and admitted most of what he knew he figured out on his own. Throughout the day, Mark spoke with nearly every employee, taking mental notes, asking open-ended questions, listening more than speaking. He made it a point to have lunch with the staff, sitting at the same long stainless steel table in the back where Jenna had cried the night before. He brought his own food from the line, nothing special, just a double burger and sweet potato fries, and sat down next to the youngest cashier, a nervous girl named Mia who had only started the week before. He asked her how her training had gone and what she wished they'd explained better, and her face lit up at being included in such a simple but respectful conversation. As the hours passed, he saw more cracks in the system, small things that, when multiplied, became big problems. The supply inventory system hadn't been updated properly, leaving staff guessing about stock levels. The scheduling software had errors that made shift swaps difficult and approvals slow. The staff bathroom's lock was broken, forcing people to use it in pairs, one holding the door shut while the other hurried. These weren't high-level business concerns. They were day-to-day realities that eroded morale. He made a list on his phone, not to send to corporate but to handle personally, and started making calls during his breaks. He phoned maintenance directly to repair the bathroom, he arranged for an audit of the scheduling system, and he began mapping out a new training program that emphasized not just task execution but team culture. On the second day of his undercover week, he spent the entire shift in the dish pit with Luis, who remained stoic but warmed over time. They worked through tray after tray of caked-on fry baskets and sauce-crusted ramekins, and in the heat of the steam and noise, Mark learned that Luis had worked at 2 previous restaurant chains and had never once seen an owner step foot into his section, let alone scrub a pan with him. "Why are you doing this?" Luis finally asked, glancing over with genuine curiosity. Mark paused, rinsing off a pan before answering. "Because it's my name on the wall," he said. "And if this place is going to represent what I believe in, I need to feel what you feel." I need to see what you see. That answer didn't require applause, it just landed with quiet weight. Luis nodded once and passed him the next tray. Word spread fast. By the third day, people began arriving for their shifts a few minutes earlier. They smiled a little more, greeted each other with less stiffness. It wasn't because they were trying to impress him. They'd realized he was one of them now. Jenna, who had watched him work quietly from a distance, finally approached him again on day 4 during a lull between lunch and dinner. They sat together at the same break room table, and she gave him a shy smile before asking, "So, what happens after this week? You go back to being famous, and we go back to broken pipes and bad managers." Mark leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table. "No," he said firmly. "This isn't a one-time thing. I came to listen so I can lead better. Real change is coming. Starting here." He told her he had already suspended Josh and was pushing for a regional restructuring that focused on employee wellness, leadership accountability, and peer mentorship. He revealed plans to implement an anonymous hotline staffed by real HR professionals and a reward system for stores that maintain top-tier workplace satisfaction. Jenna listened, both hopeful and skeptical. "People promise things all the time," she said quietly. "Then nothing happens." Mark met her gaze, unwavering. "Watch me," he said, and that was when she finally believed him. On the 5th day, Mark brought in breakfast for the whole team. Nothing fancy, just bagels, eggs, and good coffee. But he served it himself, station by station, thanking each person by name. That small gesture, more than any speech, reminded the crew that they were seen, that they mattered. On the 6th day, he called a meeting in the dining area before opening, inviting the entire team to sit around the booths and bar stools while he stood near the front counter. Not on a pedestal but eye-level, equal. He spoke from the heart, not from a teleprompter. He shared his own early struggles, his failures, the years of blue-collar work before Hollywood ever came calling. He reminded them that this place was supposed to reflect those roots. A place where the overlooked found belonging, where the tired found dignity, where effort was met with appreciation. He didn't blame them for what had gone wrong. He took ownership, and then he made a promise. From that point on, no store would be left without oversight, no team would be without support, and no cry would go unheard. The room was quiet when he finished, not because they didn't believe him, but because they did, and it stunned them. Jenna wiped a tear from her cheek as he locked eyes with her and smiled. For the first time in months, she felt like she could breathe again. And for the first time since opening that location, the staff felt like they were part of something real. That night, after the dinner rush, the crew stayed a little longer, laughing, sweeping, restocking together without complaint. The playlist someone put on wasn't corporate approved. It was fun, upbeat, and full of personality. The walls felt warmer. The floors felt lighter. And when Mark finally hung up his apron and walked out into the cool night air, he knew something had changed, not just for them, but for him. He had rediscovered the heart of what he'd built. And it wasn't in the profit margins, it was in the people. On the 7th day, after a week of immersion, sweat, and unfiltered reality, Mark stood once more in the kitchen hallway, not as a guest or a ghost, but as a man who now carried the names and burdens of every employee he'd worked beside. The silence before the store opened was heavy, different from the usual pre-rush buzz. It was the calm before something meaningful, a subtle shift that everyone could feel but not fully describe. Mark had decided this was the day he would make his identity fully known beyond the confines of this one location. Not through a press conference or social media stunt, but through a human moment that would ripple beyond these walls. He had spent the previous evening rewriting the company's internal playbook, crafting new roles for regional field officers who would rotate anonymously between locations, much like he had, reporting directly to him with unfiltered assessments. It wasn't about micromanagement. It was about reconnecting with the truth on the floor level, where the business either thrived or failed. That morning, he gathered the staff one last time, asking them to clock in early for a meeting. They trickled into the dining area, yawning, coffee in hand, faces etched with curiosity and a strange blend of hope and disbelief, unsure what to expect but willing to see it through. Mark stood in front of them again, but this time, he wasn't in an apron or holding a tray. He was holding a stack of new employee packets and updated guidelines. Tools meant to empower, not control. His voice was firm but warm as he explained what was changing. Immediate repairs scheduled for outdated equipment, a rotating mentorship program to train managers on emotional intelligence and team engagement, and an anonymous survey system tied to monthly check-ins where feedback would influence real-time adjustments. He also announced that any manager found to retaliate against an employee for speaking up would be suspended pending investigation and, if confirmed, terminated with cause. The room was quiet as his words settled over them like early morning fog, until a line cook named Trevor, who'd hardly spoken all week, murmured, "You really mean all this?" Mark didn't hesitate. "Every word," he said, locking eyes with Trevor. "And I'll be back to make sure of it. You won't know when, but I will." There were a few nervous chuckles, but also nods, the kind that came from people who had been let down before but wanted to believe again. After the meeting, Mark pulled Jenna aside and walked her into the now-clean break room, the same place where this whole journey had begun. The air was lighter here, no longer thick with despair but charged with something unspoken. He gestured for her to sit, and once she did, he slid a small folder across the table. "What's this?" she asked, brows furrowed, her fingers hesitating before touching it. "It's a transfer offer," Mark explained. "I want you at our Boston flagship location as part of our leadership development program. Full-time pay, benefits, mentorship, and if you're interested, long-term growth into management. The kind we actually need." Jenna blinked, stunned into silence, staring at the folder like it might disappear if she looked away. "Why me?" she asked quietly. "Because you spoke up," Mark replied. "Because you cared enough to cry instead of walking away. That takes courage. That takes heart." Her lips trembled, but she didn't cry this time. She just nodded, her voice small but steady. "Okay, yes, I'll do it." It wasn't a grand gesture. It was a lifeline, extended with humility and hope. The rest of the day was filled with laughter, backpats, and genuine teamwork. Felt earned, not forced. Mark walked the floor with a smile, taking time to thank everyone personally, promising to stay in touch, and urging them to hold their next manager accountable to the new standard. He collected numbers, emails, and even a few handwritten notes from staff who wanted to share their experiences beyond the confines of shift reports. He promised he'd read every one. As the sun began to set, he found himself in the alley behind the building again, the same one where he'd first stepped out of the SUV a week ago. The smell of grease and pavement was still there, but something inside him had changed. He wasn't walking away from a restaurant. He was walking toward a mission. His phone buzzed with a message from his assistant confirming that the internal memo had been distributed company-wide and that calls from other store managers were already flooding in. Some excited, some nervous, some skeptical. He knew not everyone would welcome the change, but that didn't matter. Progress rarely came without discomfort. Later that night, Mark sat alone in his hotel room, laptop open, composing a personal letter that would be sent to every employee at every level of Wahlburgers. In it, he told the story of Jenna, not by name but by spirit, the story of a single server whose tears became a turning point. He spoke about humility, about how even the most successful ventures could lose their way when they stopped listening. He asked his team to hold him accountable and to hold each other up. "If someone's crying in the break room," he wrote, "and we don't notice, we've already failed." He signed the letter not as CEO or founder, but simply Mark. When the email was sent, he turned off his screen and sat in the silence, letting the weight of the week settle. He felt tired but clear, worn but restored. His muscles ached from scrubbing and lifting, but his heart felt aligned again. Wahlburgers had started as a dream between brothers, a way to give back to their community, to build something lasting. Somewhere along the line, growth had become noise, and the foundation had cracked in quiet places. But now, the noise had quieted, and he'd heard what mattered most. He thought about Jenna's face when she read her offer letter, about Luis's small nod of respect after 6 days in the dish pit, about the line cook who laughed for the first time in months during that last shift. He knew the road ahead would be long, that systems needed rewiring and leadership needed reshaping. But he also knew that momentum had begun. Real, human momentum, not because a celebrity swooped in, but because a leader finally came home. Before turning off the lights, Mark stood at the window, looking out at the city that had shaped him. He whispered a quiet thank you, not to any person in particular, but to the moment that had stopped him in the hallway, to the sound of someone crying, and to the reminder that leadership isn't about being in front of people. It's about walking beside them, especially when they think no one is watching. The following week marked the beginning of something that no one on the Wahlburgers corporate team had expected. An active transformation across multiple locations that started not from the top down, but from the middle out, from the people who had been holding the line without recognition for far too long. Mark Wahlberg's visit had triggered a ripple effect that traveled through the company with the force of a quiet revolution. Staff who had once felt voiceless suddenly found themselves emboldened to speak, to share, to be heard. At the Boston flagship, where Jenna had now officially transferred, her arrival was greeted with curiosity and a hint of skepticism, but also with the warmth of a team that had been pre-briefed by Mark himself. She didn't come in with a title or a sense of superiority. She started on the floor just like everyone else, working the register, bussing tables, even hopping into dish duty when the night got slammed. Her story spread organically, not because she told it, but because others did. Whispers of the girl whose tears changed everything, whose honesty reached the one person who could do something about it. Jenna never called herself a leader, but people began treating her like one. When new hires had questions, they came to her. When team morale dipped during a rainy, slow lunch rush, she was the one who cracked a joke and lifted spirits. Mark kept in contact, texting her updates, asking for honest feedback, and even inviting her to sit in on virtual leadership calls where she offered real-time perspective from the ground level, something most executives rarely bothered to gather. Meanwhile, back at the original location, the changes were almost surreal. The broken bathroom door had been replaced within 24 hours of Mark's final day, and new breakroom furniture arrived just 3 days later. Simple, but functional and comfortable. Most striking of all was the replacement of Josh, who had officially been let go after multiple employee complaints were validated. In his place, Mark had appointed a temporary general manager from within, Luis, the veteran dishwasher who had proven through consistency, humility, and quiet leadership that he was far more than the man behind the steam. Luis accepted the role with modest reluctance, unsure if he was up to the challenge, but Mark had personally called him, told him that leadership wasn't about ego, it was about service, and that Luis had been doing that all along. The staff rallied behind him, offering support, patience, and genuine respect. Under Luis's watch, the energy in the store shifted again, not just because of the procedural changes, but because people were now operating with dignity. Schedules became more balanced, requests were considered thoughtfully, and Luis implemented a peer recognition board where staff could pin anonymous thank you notes for coworkers who went above and beyond. By the end of the first month, the board was full. On a broader scale, Mark used his own resources to launch what he called the Core Project, a long-term initiative focused on rebuilding the internal culture of Wahlburgers from the inside out. He hired independent consultants, not just business strategists, but social workers, teachers, and even retired military leaders who specialized in team building under stress, to help design a training curriculum that prioritized empathy, resilience, and transparency. Regional directors were required to complete the program alongside their teams, leveling the hierarchy and forcing meaningful conversations that rarely happened in sanitized corporate rooms. Mark also established a quarterly grant for employees who demonstrated extraordinary commitment or faced personal hardship, with nominations submitted anonymously by peers. The first recipient was a single mother from a New York location whose son had been diagnosed with leukemia. The company not only covered her medical leave but funded several months of treatment costs. These weren't flashy headlines or press events. They were private, deeply human acts that slowly reshaped the heart of the brand. Mark didn't publicize them because he didn't want praise, he wanted permanence. He understood now that sustainable change happened not in bursts, but in layers, day after day, choice after choice. Internally, the corporate office underwent its own reckoning. Mark reorganized the leadership structure, introducing a reverse feedback loop program where every executive was required to spend at least 3 full working days, a quarter embedded within a random store, doing hourly work and submitting a handwritten report on their experience. The reports were shared in full during monthly leadership meetings. No filters allowed. Mark also mandated the inclusion of frontline staff on advisory boards, making sure that voices from the kitchen, register, and dining room all had representation in decisions previously made behind glass walls. For many longtime staffers, these changes felt almost too good to be true. There was hesitancy, even fear, that the momentum would die out once media attention faded or when another big project pulled Mark's focus away. But Mark kept showing up, sometimes in person, sometimes virtually, and made it a point to highlight not just profits or efficiency, but humanity. When a crew member from Chicago submitted a short video explaining how the new manager training had improved morale in their location, Mark played it during an all-staff call and had the employee join the Zoom Live to share more. "Your voice matters," he told them. "Keep talking. We're listening." Back in Boston, Jenna was thriving in her new role. With Mark's encouragement, she'd started taking business classes online, paid for through a new employee development fund the company launched in her honor. It wasn't officially named after her, but those who knew the story called it Jenna's Fund. Anyway, she worked closely with store leadership to improve the onboarding process for new employees, ensuring they felt seen from day one. She even organized a wellness wall, where staff could anonymously share thoughts, needs, or just words of encouragement. One note read, "I was going to quit last week, but then someone asked how I was doing." It meant everything. That single sentence traveled all the way to Mark, who printed it and framed it in his office as a daily reminder of why this journey mattered. The transformation wasn't flashy, it wasn't about bigger stores or more menu items, but it was undeniable. Guest satisfaction scores improved, employee retention stabilized, and internal surveys showed a 38% increase in reported workplace happiness in just 3 months. But more importantly, people were smiling again, laughing again, showing up not just because they had to, but because they wanted to. Mark continued his silent visits, walking into locations unannounced, sitting in booths, tasting food, asking staff how things were going without ever pulling rank. He learned more from those unscripted conversations than he ever had from a boardroom presentation. He never stopped crediting his wake-up call to one moment: hearing Jenna cry behind a break room door and deciding to stop instead of keep walking. That moment had become his compass, a fixed point on the map of who he wanted to be, not just as a business owner but as a man. He didn't need every restaurant in America to adopt his model. He just needed his own to remember what it was built for. Wahlburgers was never about burgers. It was about people. And now, finally, it was becoming that again. Jenna would eventually go on to become a general manager at the flagship location, and then a regional leader, mentoring others just like her who thought they were too small to make a difference. But before all that, she remained who she always was: a kind, resilient soul who believed in something better and had the courage to break down instead of pretending everything was fine. Mark's final visit that quarter was to the same store where it all started. He entered through the front doors this time. No hoodie, no disguise. Customers turned and stared. Phones came out. But he waved them off gently, pointing instead to the staff behind the counter. "They're the heroes," he said. "I'm just here for the fries." And when he looked into the kitchen and saw Luis managing the line, calm and steady, he smiled. Not because it was perfect now, but because it was real. And that, in the end, was the most powerful ingredient of all.